Why can't you max out all the time?
No, don't do it like that. So, in this video, in this theory training, we're going to talk about why you can't max out all the time, but we're going to give you a few little positives
Yeah.
on why you can. And in cue intro.
You see, the problem we have with people maxing out all the time, like, firstly, we have to talk about what's maxing out. So maxing out, in my opinion, is going to 95% or above of your 1 rep max, or else the percentages where you're missing a fairly good amount of your attempts.
And that goes for snatch, clean and jerk, squat, any strength movement, any weightlifting movement, anything
Hug
like that.
attempts.
Max hug attempts. So we're going to run through the few good, and there is definitely benefits to maxing out. So we're going to run through some of the good points. And then the first one is the most obvious one. So it's the kind of leading principle in sports, which is the skill of specificity. And because if we're talking
expertly pronounced
specificity, I've been practicing. So obviously in sports, in strength sports, we have like powerlifting and weightlifting. Our goal is to lift the most amount of weight possible, and eventually those weights are new maximum attempts or very close to those. So we need to practice this skill of maxing or hitting heavy weights. So when we max out an awful lot, we get phenomenal practice at maxing. So we get great time at practicing this skill of maxing weights. So we talk a lot about how different kind of percentages of your maximum weight are almost like specific skills in of themselves. So 75% is a vastly different kind of feeling and a different kind of skill. It's almost like a different lift in some ways, especially in weightlifting. Like they are almost like different lifts at 75% as opposed to 90+%.
Yeah, so I think like there's that element of skill, right, where the muscle has to contract faster, it has to contract stronger. So like your physiology and the way it adapts is very, very different. The other kind of skill associated with maxing out is understanding your warm-ups, understanding your jumps, understanding the attempts that will come beforehand, having a very good idea of like the feeling of the lifts as you're building up to maximum attempts. And that's something that at every weightlifting competition or every powerlifting competition, you'll see somebody like maybe miss their last warm-up before their opener, or they'll do something that doesn't follow the plan in their head. And definitely the advantage to having more frequent max outs or being able to go to higher intensities more often in training is that you get very, very good at that kind of skill, and you build up a kind of bank of knowledge about how to lift heavy weights frequently.
But then we'll get to actually later. So then the next skill is one that
hang around till later.
Hang around till the bad parts. So Fitz's favorite one would be psychologically strong. So we will have a podcast coming out later in a few weeks on the psychology training in terms of fear. But the fear of weights, and I would say either a fear of getting underweight or a fear of failure more often than not. And this is often so fear often dissipates from acclimatizing yourself to a stimulus. And then these heavy weights are just another stimulus. So sometimes if you start missing heavy weights, which is one of the problems, you kind of, you may ingrain some bad habits, but attempting heavy weights helps you overcome this fear by exposing yourself to heavy weights. Because quite often, like for example, in a heavy deadlift, the bar will feel incredibly heavy if you're not used to maxing your deadlift, or walking out a squat. The bar might feel incredibly heavy.
Even just things are different. Like even the way the bar will whip at heavier weights will be very, very different from what you'll have at like training weights, or even like the way your foot interacts with the sole of your shoe is going to be different. So I think like that, the exposure therapy model, like if somebody's afraid of spiders and you put them into a room with a spider and you gradually move them closer and closer to the spider, that is an advantage of having fairly frequent high intensity attempts in your training. It seems like we're giving loads of positives about maxing out all the time.
And we are, because we're in the positive section of the video.
Yeah, wait. So then to move on, right? So we talked about the kind of physiological thing. And there is definitely an advantage to being hyper specific in the sports of weightlifting, in any of the throwing, in any of the classic kind of power sports. If you're just doing the specific movement, so whether that be a sprint, whether that be a 1 rep max snatch, you're at a stage at the force velocity curve where the muscular fatigue you get from doing a single one of these movements is incredibly low. Like I think besides like a 1 rep max clean and jerk, which will fatigue you, it still won't fatigue you anywhere near as much as doing complex work or multiple sets at a certain percentage with a clean and jerk will.
So that is one of the benefits, for example, of the snatch clean jerk, like Fitz said, is the snatch in particular is not very fatiguing because obviously there is no eccentric loading in a heavy 1RM snatch. So you can practice these a lot within reason and not be fatigued in the typical sense. So actually what it will end up happening is you'll get some kind of psychological fatigue also. But in terms of just like kind of biological fatigue, like physical fatigue, you won't actually incur an awful lot. Now heavy clean and jerks are a little bit different in that regard. But in terms of the fatigue you might get from very high volume training, for example, if you're to do something stupid like German volume training, you would incur a massive amount of fatigue in your tendons, your joints,
and this
ligaments.
is particularly about like muscular fatigue,
Yep.
joints, tendons, the kind of physical structures that dictate us being able to contract muscles and move bones. Yeah, so like a kind of classical example of that, where you get really low muscular fatigue, but you get large amounts of CNS fatigue, would be, I'd say I spent a good 1.5 or 2 years of weightlifting where I went to 1 rep max attempts every couple of days, and that was in like training probably 6 or 7 times a week, sometimes more, making zero progress, and it would just gradually whittle away. And like the 1 rep max back squat that used to happen every single Saturday slowly went from like whatever it was, like I was young, like I went from like 180 or 190 down to like 165 for a grindy single, and that's when you start to see like, oh, maybe I'm not getting any training effect, because every session used to be snatch heavy. Sometimes I'd maybe do like a snatch pull plus a snatch going heavy, like as heavy as I could go for that session. I might do a double every so often. I'd say I never touched the bar for more than 1 rep at a clean and jerk for about 14 or 15 months. Because all I wanted to do was lift heavy weights.
I think one of the biggest mistakes I made was not doing... So in weightlifting, high reps are actually one of the best ways of improving your technique. And it was something I just...
Your what? Your technique?
Improving your techers.
Oh,
so
right.
it was... The first time I snatched 110, I missed it 15 times. There's actually a video of that as well, of every single miss. It's on one of our friends, Paulie's YouTube pages, and I hope it's still up there. And I was maxing an awful lot when I was coaching myself. And I made progress, but I also got hurt a lot, as I mentioned to Fitz before. I had great fun training, but I had a lot of injuries. And while I got very good at attempting heavy weights, I was also slow. My technique wasn't good enough. And like I just did that for years. And I obviously learned a lot from training, and this is one of the reasons we can help people now. But when I think about it, it was so dumb.
Yeah. Like an interesting point there is the slowness. Like,
yeah,
you lose that like sharp tip of the spear when you're constantly going heavy.
Yeah.
And that is like one of the bad points. Like one of the negatives we have is like the central nervous system fatigue you have from doing super high intensity attempts multiple times per week or multiple times in a training cycle. You just can't always bring the A game, you know, like if you always bring the A game, then you're probably bringing a C game most of the time.
Yeah.
And like central nervous system fatigue by its very nature takes a long time to go away. Like you could be talking about up to 10 or 11 days for 1 rep max deadlift attempts. And that kind of fatigue just doesn't happen at lower intensities and higher volumes.
So that segues us into the second negative of maxing out an awful lot is you don't actually have enough volume to progress. So if you look at something like the Bulgarians, and they would train, I think it was like 4 times a day, was it?
Yeah.
So like 45-minute sessions, right? And you would think that they're doing so many singles that all that volume adds up to appropriate number of lifts at the end of every month. But it actually... It feels like it does, considering how much lifting they're doing and how long their sessions are taking and how many hours a day of training that adds up to. But there's specific stimuluses that elicit
Stimuli
that elicit specific responses in your training. So if you do 2 singles a minute apart, it is a very, very, or 3 single within 5 minutes. It's a very, very different lift in a snatch, for example, for doing a triple where you don't drop the bar, where you don't let go of it, where you get that triple done within 4 seconds. And the result of that stimulus is not the same thing as doing lots of singles. So doing 5 sets of 3 or 15 sets of 1 have very, very different results on your snatch, your clean and jerk, your back squat, your deadlift, any of those. Like, they are a very, very different lift again. Like, they are different skills, but they also have different results in your training. And when you only do maxing, there's a couple of reasons you don't end up with enough volume. One is you just physically don't do enough volume.
Yeah.
Like, you actually just don't do it. Two, you're not able to do enough volume because the weights are so heavy. You couldn't possibly do enough reps to elicit useful responses in your training to do enough volume, where you just have to force some adaptation.
Yeah. I think, like, and volume at the moment is kind of viewed as the key to gaining strength, and definitely the key to muscle hypertrophy. So, like, if you're involved in any of the strength or power sports, in any field sport, like, training volume is very, very, very important.
It's
like,
always
it can't be understated. I think, like, another negative of maxing out too frequently is that you never get variance with your training, right? So we talked about sport-specific training or specificity earlier. The nature of trying to make technical alterations to your, like, specific techniques, or possibly trying to alter a way in which you play the game, you do whatever it is, you need some amount of training variance, right? And especially if you're a younger athlete, or even if you're an adult but you haven't been training for that long, training variance is one of the ways you build up that kind of physical literacy. So your ability to move and interact with things in a skillful way comes through variance and comes through doing lots of things in different ways slightly. So in sports like weightlifting, variance is virtually null and void, right? Most people do lots of snatches or things similar to snatches. They do lots of clean and jerks or things similar to clean and jerks, and then they'll do some strength movements. But even when you look at something like weightlifting and you look at trying to change a certain flaw in someone's technique, so like if Gerf last week wasn't getting his knees out of the way fast enough, he has to bring in some amount of variance, like possibly doing like a first pull to the knee, then going back down, then doing a clean or something along those lines. It allows for a certain amount of variance to bring about alterations. If you're maxing out all the time, where every session is a 1 rep max attempt, like the kind of West Side model, as if you're doing West Side but maxing out all the time, you can't really train like that, because you'd be bringing in a different stimulus every time.
Then there's a last bonus point that I want to add. That
Right.
I think so. We had the psychologically strong from maxing out a lot, and I think that it's.
People get so broken mentally from maxing out all the time.
I was going to.
I forgot all about this.
So, well, actually, what I was going to say is, I think it's a sign of psychological weakness that you can't bring yourself to appropriately load your training. That you can't go, this is how to train smart. I think it's a form of mental laziness, almost a psychological kind of. It's.
Because people always want to know where they are.
Yeah.
You need to know exactly.
That's it, Fitz.
Yeah.
Where when people can't go, look, this triple at 75% doesn't feel like I can do my 1RM anymore, but
Yeah, maybe I'll just try it.
I know this works because I've done this before.
Yeah.
And so instead of saying, like what Fitz just said there, maybe I'll just go up after rather than doing what your coach said and do your 4 sets of 3. You go for your heavy single. You've made yourself tired from that session. You're tired. Your 1RM does actually feel lower now because you did your triples and you shouldn't have done your heavy single after. You know, stuff like that, where just seeing where you are and not being able to hold yourself back appropriately in training, I think is a sign that of you are psychologically weak.
Yeah. I will say as well that
What was
like
the other one you said?
people can get mentally broken down from constantly maxing.
From not improving.
Yeah, because you don't improve, the number doesn't go up. You're probably missing a lot of lifts now at this stage, because like maxing out means you miss something.
Yeah.
You know, or you have some sort of technical breakdown or physical breakdown that like means you're not going to make the next lift, and that can be pretty psychologically damaging to people. I don't know why I'm smiling when I say that. I like if
psychopath.
What I would say, right?
Yeah.
If you think you're in this cohort of people, which, Christ, I definitely was for a long time. You definitely were as well. Yes. We've come across, I'd say, more than 100 weightlifters in the last year who are in this position now.
Yep.
Like, this is just something that everybody does for a while. If you're in that group of people now, like, just look back over your last 2 weeks of training. And unless you have, like, obviously if you're tapering for something or if you're in a specific phase of training, but if you just have been doing the same thing over and over again, like if you keep doing the same things, you'll keep getting the same results. So like take a look at your last 2-3 weeks of training, or even last 2 months of training. And if you feel like you've been doing the same thing constantly and not getting any better, maybe you need to look elsewhere.
And so,
or else just stop the sport, because you mightn't be any good at it.
thanks for watching. So we really appreciate when you leave a like and a comment for the algorithm, and also we really appreciate when you suggest ideas for our RTO training videos. So if you have anything you want us to see talk about, or just anything in this video we mentioned that you liked and you want to hear more about, feel free to leave it in the comments. If you just like the video, we like when you tell us. It all helps.
I'm wearing chinos today and Gerf is wearing shorts as well, so just let us know. Some of us were working at an office job.
Not for much longer.
Not for much longer.
One
thank
more
God.
week.
Huh?
Thanks for watching.